The headlights cut through the fog as Ethan drove down the winding road toward Maplewood. The town where time seemed to have stopped long ago. The night air carried the scent of wet pine and distant rain. It had been nearly 10 years since he'd last driven this route. But everything looked the same: the crooked fence near the old bridge, the flickering streetlight outside the bakery, and the small houses huddled together like they were trying to stay warm. He shouldn't have come back. That was what he told himself as the engine hummed beneath him. Yet here he was, one suitcase in the back seat, and a heart that felt heavier with every passing mile. His grandmother Margaret had called him a week ago. Her voice had been calm but tired, like a song slowly fading. "Ethan," she'd said, "come home before winter. There's something I need to tell you." She didn't explain what it was. She didn't have to. There was a certain weight in her words, the kind that made him feel like time was running out. Now, as he neared the edge of town, the memories started returning: his childhood summers, chasing fireflies in the fields behind her house, the way she'd hum softly while baking bread, the way she always seemed to know when something was wrong even before he spoke. But there were also the memories he didn't want to face. The last argument with his father, the love he let slip away, and the guilt he carried like a shadow he could never outwalk. When he finally turned onto Oakwood Lane, the familiar white cottage appeared through the mist. The porch light was on, flickering like it had been waiting just for him. His chest tightened at the sight. He parked the car, stepped out into the cool air, stood there for a long moment before knocking. The door opened almost instantly, and there she was, Margaret. Her silver hair framed her face softly, and her eyes, though a little dimmer than before, still held that same steady warmth. For a second, she didn't say anything. She just looked at him, her lips trembling into a smile. "You came," she said finally. He nodded. "You asked me to." Margaret reached out and placed her hand on his cheek, her touch gentle, grounding. "I wasn't sure you would," she whispered. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words caught in his throat. So instead, he did what felt right. He stepped forward and hugged her. She was smaller than he remembered, her shoulders frail under his arms, yet she held him tightly, as if trying to remind him that home wasn't just a place, it was a person. Inside, everything was just as he remembered it. The scent of lavender tea, the ticking of the old clock, the photographs lining the mantel. The house seemed untouched by time, though it carried the quiet sadness of years gone by. He dropped his bag by the door and glanced around. "It hasn't changed a bit," he said softly. Margaret smiled faintly. "Some things aren't meant to." They sat at the kitchen table, where 2 cups of steaming tea waited. It was like she had known exactly when he'd arrive. For a while, they didn't speak. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, was thick with the kind of understanding that doesn't need words. Finally, she broke it. "You look tired," she said gently. "Your eyes tell me you've been carrying something heavy." Ethan gave a half smile. "Guess I take after you then?" Margaret chuckled softly. "You might, but I learned to put things down once in a while." He looked away, tracing the edge of his cup with his thumb. "I'm not sure I remember how." Outside, the wind picked up, brushing against the windows like a whisper from the past. The fire in the hearth flickered, painting the walls in golden shadow. Ethan could feel the warmth, but inside, there was still a coldness he couldn't shake, a space that no comfort seemed to fill. "Grandma," he said quietly, "why did you call me back?" She looked at him for a long moment, her gaze soft but unreadable. Then she reached for a small wooden box on the counter and placed it between them. "This," she said, tapping it gently, "is part of the reason." Ethan frowned. The box was old, worn at the edges, tied shut with a faded red ribbon. He recognized it from his childhood. It used to sit on the top shelf of her cabinet, always locked, always out of reach. "I thought you told me never to touch this," he said. "I did," she replied, her voice steady. "Because you weren't ready to know what's inside." He hesitated. "And now?" She smiled faintly. "Now, maybe you are." The sound of rain began again, soft at first, then steadier, filling the silence between them. The cottage seemed smaller, the world outside fading into a blur of gray and shadow. Ethan looked down at the box, then back at her. "What's in it?" Margaret didn't answer right away. She sipped her tea, her hands trembling slightly. When she finally spoke, her voice carried both sadness and peace. "Memories," she said. "Ones I've kept hidden for a long time. They're about love, loss, and the choices that change who we become." He felt something stir in his chest, curiosity, but also a quiet ache. "Why tell me now?" Margaret's eyes met his, full of the kind of truth that didn't need to be spoken aloud. "Because you're standing at the same crossroad I once did," she whispered. "And before you decide your path, you deserve to know mine." Ethan didn't fully understand what she meant, but he could feel it. The weight in her words, the quiet urgency in her tone. And as the rain fell harder against the windows, he knew one thing for certain. Whatever was inside that box, whatever story she was about to tell him, it would change everything he thought he knew about her, and maybe about himself, too. The rain continued to fall through the night, tapping softly against the window like an old song. The wooden box still sat on the table between them, silent, mysterious, almost alive with untold memories. Ethan stared at it for a long time before speaking. "I used to wonder what was in there when I was a kid," he said quietly. "I thought maybe it was treasure, or old photographs." Margaret smiled, the kind of smile that comes from remembering something precious. "In a way, you were right. They are treasures. Just not the kind you can spend." She untied the red ribbon slowly, her fingers trembling. Inside were letters, folded papers, a pressed flower or two, and a photograph so old it had begun to fade. Ethan leaned closer. The picture showed a young woman, his grandmother, standing by a lake, sunlight on her hair. Beside her was a man he didn't recognize. "That's you," he said softly. "But who's he?" Margaret looked down, her eyes gentle and distant. "His name was James Whitaker," she whispered. "And once I thought I'd spend the rest of my life with him." Ethan sat back in silence. He'd never heard her mention anyone but his grandfather. Henry. To him, she had always been the picture of steady love and quiet strength. It was strange to imagine her young, full of dreams. "And standing at the beginning of her own story, I met him when I was about your age," she said, her voice carrying a soft tremor. "It was summer and I was helping at the town library. He came in one afternoon, soaking wet from the rain, holding a stack of books he'd borrowed months before. He apologized for being late, and somehow we ended up talking for hours." She smiled at the memory, her eyes lighting up in a way Ethan hadn't seen in years. He had this way of listening, like the whole world stopped until you finished your sentence. I'd never met anyone like him. Ethan felt something stir inside him, an ache that came from knowing he'd once felt the same way about someone too. "What happened to him?" Ethan asked gently. Margaret looked at the fire for a long moment before answering. "Life happened," she said softly. "He wanted to travel, to paint, to see the world. I wanted to build a home. We loved each other deeply, but love alone doesn't always mean you can walk the same road." Ethan nodded slowly. The words hit somewhere deep. He thought of Claire, the woman he had once loved, but pushed away when things got complicated. She had wanted him to take a chance, to believe in something more than fear. But Ethan had chosen safety instead. Distance? Silence. Margaret noticed the change in his face. "You're thinking of someone," she said quietly. He hesitated, then nodded. "Her name's Claire. We haven't spoken in a while." Margaret tilted her head. "Did you love her?" "Yes," he said, almost under his breath. "But I thought love wasn't enough." She smiled sadly. "Then you and I have more in common than I thought." The fire cracked softly, filling the silence that followed. Ethan looked at her hands, frail, lined with age, yet still steady as she held one of the letters. "You know," she said, her tone light but thoughtful, "your grandfather never knew about James. Not because I hid him, but because by the time I met Henry, that chapter of my heart had already turned into a memory. I still thought of James, sometimes wondered if he ever found what he was searching for. But your grandfather, he gave me something I didn't know I needed. Peace." Ethan leaned back, letting her words sink in. So, you stopped loving James? Margaret shook her head gently. No, dear. I just learned to love differently. Some loves are meant to shape us, not stay with us. Her words hung in the air like a quiet truth. Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat. He had spent years running from what hurt him, convincing himself that moving on meant forgetting. But maybe it didn't. Maybe it meant remembering. Without letting it control you, Margaret smiled faintly, watching the fire dance. Do you remember that summer when you stayed here after your parents' accident? She asked. Ethan nodded. Of course. I was 12. You were so quiet back then, she said softly. You barely spoke for weeks. But every morning you'd sit by the window and draw the same tree outside. I asked you once why, and you said because it's still standing. Ethan gave a smile. The rain had stopped sometime after midnight, leaving the air cool and heavy with the scent of wet earth. Ethan sat by the window of the guest room, unable to sleep. Outside, the garden shimmered under a silver moon, every leaf glistening as though brushed by memory. He couldn't stop thinking about what his grandmother had said, that some loves are meant to shape us, not stay with us. Those words lingered in his mind like a quiet echo. He reached for his phone, almost without thinking, and scrolled through his contacts. Claire's name was still there. He hadn't deleted it, though he'd told himself 100 times that he should. His thumb hovered over the call button, but he didn't press it. Not yet. Some things still felt unfinished, like an old photograph left half-developed, waiting for light. The next morning, sunlight poured into the kitchen, warm and golden. Margaret was already awake, sitting at the table with her tea, a small vase of daisies beside her. She smiled when she saw Ethan walk in. Morning, dear, she said softly. Did you sleep? He shook his head. Not much. Good, she said with a knowing grin. That means your heart's still thinking. Ethan chuckled, sitting across from her. You always did have a way of making sleepless nights sound poetic. Ah! She shrugged playfully. Age teaches you that the soul doesn't rest until it's ready. He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat quietly for a moment. The smell of toast and wildflower honey filled the air, comforting and familiar. Margaret studied him thoughtfully. You used to hum when you worked, she said. What happened to that? He looked up, surprised. You remember that? Of course, she said, her eyes twinkling. You'd sit on the porch with your sketchbook, humming some tune you'd make up on the spot. You stopped when you left Maplewood. Ethan sighed. I stopped a lot of things after I left. Her tone softened. Maybe it's time to start again. A few hours later, Ethan stepped outside to get some air. The garden looked wild but beautiful, just the way his grandmother liked it. Roses climbed up the fence. The grass smelled of rain. And somewhere in the distance, he could hear the old church bells echoing through the valley. He walked around, taking it all in. That's when he saw a faded wooden easel, leaning against the shed. It was covered with a thin sheet, but he knew immediately what it was. He lifted the cover and smiled. It was his grandmother's old painting stand. Beneath the dust lay a half-finished canvas, its colors still faintly alive despite the years. The image was of the same lake from the photograph, the place where she'd once stood with James. For a long time, Ethan just stared at it. Then, quietly, he picked up a brush. When Margaret came outside and saw him standing there, her eyes softened. I wondered if you'd find that, she said. He turned, smiling faintly. You never told me you painted? She walked closer, her hand brushing the canvas like she was touching an old friend. James taught me, she said. He said painting was a way to remember without losing yourself in the past. Ethan looked at her, really seeing her for the first time, not just as his grandmother, but as a woman who had lived deeply, loved fully, and carried those memories with grace. He dipped the brush into the faded blue paint and began to add gentle strokes across the sky. Margaret watched silently, her eyes glistening with both pride and nostalgia. You haven't forgotten how, she said. I didn't think I remembered, he admitted. Sometimes, she whispered, our hearts remember before our hands do. Later that afternoon, while Ethan was cleaning the brushes, his phone buzzed on the porch. He glanced at the screen and froze. It was a message from Claire. "Hey, I don't know if you're still in town, but I heard you were back in Maplewood. Hope you're doing okay." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't told anyone he was here. The only explanation was that someone had mentioned it's someone like his grandmother, perhaps. He turned to where Margaret was sitting in her rocking chair, reading quietly. "Did you tell anyone I was back?" he asked. She didn't look up from her book. "I might have spoken to a few people at church," she said casually. "Small towns have big mouths, dear." Ethan smiled, shaking his head. "You did this on purpose, didn't you?" She finally looked up, a mischievous sparkle in her eyes. "I don't meddle, Ethan. I simply let life do what it wants to do." As the evening fell, he sat on the porch again, the message still glowing on his phone. He typed a reply, erased it, typed again, then stopped. Margaret joined him with 2 cups of tea. "You're thinking too hard again," she said softly. He smiled faintly. "It's not easy, you know, reaching out after all this time." "I know," she said, "but neither is wondering what could have been." He looked at her, her silver hair glowing in the dim light. "You really believe in second chances?" She nodded, her eyes kind and certain. "I don't just believe in them. I've lived them." The words settled in his chest like warmth. He looked back at the phone and finally typed the message. "Hi, Claire. Yeah, I'm here. Maybe we could talk sometime." He pressed send. The moment the message went through, he exhaled a slow, trembling breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Margaret smiled softly. "There now. Doesn't that feel lighter?" He nodded. "A little." She reached over and squeezed his hand. "Good. Because sometimes, Ethan, the past doesn't return to haunt us. It comes back to help us begin again." The porch light flickered gently as the crickets began to sing. Somewhere inside the house, the clock chimed 8 times. Ethan looked out over the quiet fields, feeling something he hadn't in years hoped. He didn't know what the next day would bring or what Claire would say. But for the first time, he wasn't afraid to find out. Margaret leaned back in her chair, watching him with a smile. In her eyes was the quiet satisfaction of someone who knew that love, no matter how lost, always finds a way home. And as the night deepened around them, Ethan realized something profound. The lesson his grandmother was teaching him wasn't just about the past. It was about courage, the courage to open your heart again, even after you've convinced yourself it's too late. The next morning began with the soft hum of birds outside the kitchen window. The world felt strangely calm, as if holding its breath. Ethan sat at the table staring at his untouched coffee. The night before lingered in his thoughts the message to Claire, his grandmother's quiet encouragement, and that haunting painting of the lake. Margaret moved around the kitchen slowly, her every motion careful and thoughtful. She poured water into the kettle, her hands steady despite her years. Ethan watched her for a moment, realizing how much of his life had been built on the quiet strength of this one woman. "Did you sleep?" she asked without turning. "Some," he said. "Mostly thought about what you said." She smiled faintly. "That's good. Thinking means your heart is still listening." He gave a small laugh, though there wasn't much humor in it. "You make it sound simple." "Nothing about love is simple," she replied. "But it is honest. When it hurts, it's because it mattered." The kettle began to whistle softly. Margaret turned off the flame and poured 2 cups of tea. Handing one to Ethan, the steam rose between them, curling like fragile threads of memory. "You know," she said after a pause, "I never told your grandfather the whole story about James. Not because I wanted to hide it, but because it wasn't something words could fix." Ethan looked up, surprised. "You mean you still thought about him?" Margaret nodded slowly. "For years. But not with regret. Just wonder. I wondered what his life became, whether he ever finished that painting he started, or if he ever found the peace he was searching for. But when I met your grandfather, I realized something. Love doesn't erase love. It simply grows around it, like ivy on an old wall." Her words were soft, but they carried the weight of a lifetime. Ethan could see it now, how she carried the memory of one man in her heart while building a life with another. It wasn't betrayal. It was acceptance. He stared into his tea. I'm not sure I could do that, he admitted. When I lost Claire, I told myself it was better to close that chapter completely. I didn't want to carry it. Margaret's eyes softened. And has it helped? He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling through the trees. Margaret stood and walked to the window, looking out at the garden. Do you know what I remember most about James? She said after a moment. Not the words we said, not the letters he wrote, but the silences. The times when we sat side by side, saying nothing, yet understanding everything. She turned toward Ethan, her gaze warm and distant all at once. Sometimes the most powerful truths are the ones we never speak. Ethan swallowed hard. You think that's what I need to do with Claire? Leave things unspoken. Margaret shook her head. No, dear, you've already done that long enough. What I'm saying is don't be afraid of silence, but don't mistake it for peace. The words you keep inside can turn into walls if you leave them there too long. Later that afternoon, while Margaret rested, Ethan stepped outside again. The sky was gray and gentle, the air thick with the scent of damp earth. He walked to the garden and stopped by the old easel. The unfinished painting still stood there, soft blues and greens blending into something both broken and beautiful. He picked up a brush and began adding colors slowly, carefully. Each stroke felt like a release, each line a confession he hadn't been able to make a loud dot after some time. He heard the creak of the porch steps behind him. Margaret stood there wrapped in her shawl, watching him paint. It's beautiful, she said softly. You have your mother's too. The next few days passed in a soft blur of quiet moments. Ethan stayed longer than he'd planned, helping Margaret with small things around the house, fixing a leaky faucet, trimming the garden hedge, and repainting the front steps that had faded from years of sunlight. Each task carried a sense of purpose, but beneath it all was an undercurrent of emotion, something he couldn't quite name. He began to notice the way the light shifted through the old windows, how the wind carried the faint scent of jasmine from the backyard. This house, once just a childhood memory, now felt alive again. But it wasn't the house, it was her presence, her calm voice, and the way she saw meaning in things that others overlooked. One afternoon, while Margaret rested, Ethan sat in the attic, sifting through old boxes. Dust floated like silver in the sunlight. Inside one of the boxes, he found a small leather-bound book, the kind that looked like it had been opened 1,000 times. He hesitated, then gently untied the string and opened it. It was Margaret's handwriting. Each page was dated, starting from decades ago. He began to read. June 14th, 1961 today. I saw James again at the lake. He said he was leaving for the city soon. I told him I was happy for him, but my voice betrayed me. I wanted to tell him not to go, but I didn't. I smiled instead. He smiled back, and that was the end. August 2nd, 1974, sometimes I still think of him. Not in longing anymore, but in gratitude. He showed me what it means to care deeply even when the world doesn't understand it. I hope he found peace. October 10th, 1990, Ethan's mother asked about the lake today. She said she wanted to take him there someday. Maybe she sensed what it meant to me. Maybe love leaves traces we can't erase. Ethan's hand trembled slightly as he closed the book. He felt as if he'd stepped into a secret world, a world of love that had survived in silence. It wasn't a confession of regret. It was a lesson in grace. He carried the book downstairs, still holding it like something sacred. Margaret was in her favorite chair, a soft blanket around her shoulders. She looked up and smiled when she saw him. Found my old journals, did you? She said gently. He nodded. I didn't mean to read them, but I couldn't stop. It's all right, she said. They were waiting for you. Ethan sat beside her. You really loved him, didn't you? Margaret's eyes shimmered. I did. But love isn't always about holding on. Sometimes it's about letting go and wishing them well from afar. He nodded slowly. I think I understand that now. Claire and I, we didn't end because we stopped caring. We just stopped being brave. She reached out, her wrinkled hand resting gently on his. Then maybe it's time to be brave again. Her words hung in the air. Ethan felt something shift inside him like a door quietly opening. That evening, the house was filled with the sound of rain. The windows glowed with reflections of water streaming down the glass. Margaret sat near the fireplace while Ethan sorted through some of her old art supplies. "You used to paint with me when you were little," she said softly. "You'd always mix too much blue." He smiled. "Blue felt like calm." "It still does," she said. "But calm isn't always peace, Ethan. Sometimes it's just silence trying to look strong." He looked up at her, startled by the quiet power in her words. "What do you mean?" She took a deep breath. "I mean that silence can protect us, but it can also imprison us. You've been silent about Claire for years." Why, Ethan hesitated. The rain outside seemed to echo the pounding in his chest. "Because I was scared," he admitted. "Scared that if I reached out again, it would hurt just like before. Scared that I'd look weak for still caring." Margaret's expression softened. "Caring isn't weakness. It's proof that your heart's still open." He swallowed hard. "But what if it's too late?" She smiled faintly. "It's never too late for truth." There was a long silence, then gentle, unhurried. Ethan could hear the clock ticking in the next room, and then, as if moved by some invisible force, he stood and walked toward the window. Outside, the rain fell heavier now, drumming softly on the porch roof. He took out his phone, his hand trembling just slightly. He opened his messages and scrolled to a name he hadn't seen in years. Claire. For a long moment, he just stared at it. Then he began to type. "Hi, Claire. I don't expect anything, but I wanted to tell you something I should have said years ago. I never stopped wishing you well. I never stopped being grateful for what we had. I just didn't know how to say it. I hope life has been kind to you." He hesitated, thumb hovering over the send button. Margaret's voice broke the silence. "Don't think about what comes next," she said softly. "Just let your heart breathe." He pressed send. For the first time in years, Ethan felt lighter. He turned toward Margaret, and she was smiling through tears. "There," she whispered. "That's what I wanted you to find." He frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "The courage to speak your truth," she said. "That's what love really teaches us. Not how to hold on, but how to be honest, even when it hurts." Ethan knelt beside her chair, taking her hands gently. "You knew this would happen, didn't you?" She chuckled softly. "I hoped it would. I just needed you to remember that silence can be beautiful, but only when it comes after the truth." They stayed like that for a long time, listening to the rain. Outside, the storm began to fade, and somewhere in the distance, a hint of moonlight broke through the clouds. In that quiet glow, Ethan realized something profound. His grandmother hadn't just been teaching him about her past. She had been preparing him to face his own, and for the first time in years, he felt ready. Ready to forgive. Ready to speak. Ready to begin again. The following morning, Maplewood seemed softer, bathed in a golden light that filtered through the thin mist hanging over the fields. The rain had washed the town clean, leaving the streets glimmering like glass. Ethan woke with a sense of quiet calm he hadn't felt in years. His chest no longer felt heavy, and the weight of unspoken words had lifted, replaced by a strange, steady warmth. He walked into the kitchen, and Margaret was already there, humming softly as she prepared breakfast. The aroma of fresh bread and honey drifted through the room, comforting and familiar. "Good morning," she said, smiling. "You slept well?" Ethan nodded, smiling back. "For the first time in a long while, yes?" Margaret handed him a cup of tea. "I think you needed this trip home more than you realized." He took a sip and looked out the window at the dew-kissed garden. For the first time, the old cottage felt complete, not because of its walls or furniture, but because he was present in it fully, finally in touch with his feelings and memories later. He found himself standing at the edge of the old lake, where Margaret had spent so many summers long ago. The water reflected the pale morning sky, still and calm. He held his phone tightly, thinking of Claire. He had sent his message the night before, and now there was a new quiet. One that waited with gentle anticipation instead of fear. Then his phone vibrated. "Ethan, thank you for your message. I've missed you too. I'd like to see you." His heart skipped a beat, But it wasn't the nervous, tight feeling of fear. It was a gentle, steady excitement. He felt a quiet courage he hadn't known he possessed. He typed back a simple reply, "I'll see you tomorrow." When he returned to the cottage, Margaret was sitting on the porch with a shawl around her shoulders. She looked up as he approached, and her smile was soft but knowing. "You've changed overnight," she said. Ethan laughed lightly. "I guess I've finally remembered how to speak what's in my heart." She reached over and squeezed his hand. Sometimes all we need is someone to remind us that life is too short to stay silent. He nodded, looking at her with gratitude. "You did more than remind me. You taught me." Margaret's eyes shimmered. "Then I did my job." The afternoon passed in quiet conversation. They shared memories, old photographs, and stories of the town. Margaret told him of the people she had loved, the choices she had made, and the lessons she had learned. Each story was a small gift, a bridge connecting past and present, shaping Ethan's understanding of life, love, and courage. Ethan realized that the journey he had taken to find closure with his past, his feelings, and even Claire had started with her. Her wisdom and quiet strength had given him the courage to face what he had avoided for so long. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Ethan and Margaret stepped onto the porch together. The garden was bathed in warm light, the flowers glowing with the last rays of the day. "Tomorrow," Ethan said quietly, "I'll meet Claire. I think this might be a new beginning for both of us." Margaret smiled, her eyes reflecting pride and peace. "Remember, Ethan, beginnings are not always about grand gestures. Sometimes they are small and quiet, like a conversation, a laugh, or simply showing up." He nodded, feeling the truth in her words. "I understand now. Love isn't always dramatic. It's patient, it's brave, and it waits for the courage to be honest." She reached for his hand again. "Exactly. And I've seen your courage tonight." That evening, as the first stars appeared in the sky, they sat together in silence, watching the twilight descend over Maplewood. The house was quiet, the world beyond the trees hushed. For Ethan, it was a rare moment of pure clarity. He realized that life didn't always follow the path we expect. Hearts could be broken, love could be lost, but the chance to speak the truth, to reconcile with the past, and to embrace hope was always present. He thought of Claire, of the words he had finally sent, and he felt a gentle peace wash over him. No matter what,